The US government has taken a 10% stake in Intel. On the surface, that sounds simple, but the deal itself is very odd. No money was actually exchanged, investors were angry, and now Washington has direct influence over America's biggest chip foundry. The more you look at it, the stranger it gets. Why did the US take 10% of Intel and not of other tech giants? Why would a government even want 10% of a private company? And what makes it even more unusual is this: Trump did it by using a law that was passed under Biden. To understand what is going on, we need some context. In November 2024, tech CEOs started to realize the game had changed.
In particular, in the very near future, we're going to be placing tariffs on foreign production of computer chips, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals to return production of these essential goods to the United States of America.
The new government was very clear. It wanted to protect and grow US industries. Almost every big tech company was given a simple choice: invest in the United States or pay the price. Nowhere was this clearer than on 4 September 2025. On that day, Trump hosted a roundtable dinner with most of the top tech CEOs: Tim Cook, Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Lisa Su, Bill Gates, and many others. The scene itself was remarkable. Zuckerberg, who had previously banned Trump from his platform and been threatened with jail by him, was now sitting right next to him. That meeting showed a basic truth. If you want to survive long-term in AI, chips, and cloud computing, you need to line up with US national policy. Trump is using both carrot and stick. If you keep production and investment outside the US, you risk tariffs. If you build inside the US, you can get tariff relief and special permits, for example for AI energy use. The CEOs did not waste time showing where they stood. Satya Nadella told Trump that you and your policies are really helping a lot. Sam Altman thanked him for being such a pro-business and pro-innovation president. Much of this is likely flattery aimed at whoever is in the White House, but the important part is this: the big money is now moving in the direction Trump wants.
How much is Google investing?
We are well north of $100 billion. In the next 2 years, it's $250 billion.
Apple has announced a $500 billion investment in the US, with plans to create 20,000 jobs. Tim Cook has also said they will add another $100 billion on top of that. Microsoft has pledged over $75 billion in US investment this year alone. Nvidia has promised more than $500 billion over the next 4 years. Jensen Huang summed up how they see this money. AI is now infrastructure, and this infrastructure, just like the internet, just like electricity, needs factories. These AI data centers are in fact AI factories. In other words, they are treating AI data centers the way earlier generations treated power plants or telecom networks. For now, all of this is still just talk. These are commitments on paper, not yet projects in the ground. We will have to see how much of this spending actually happens. But this leads to a more important question. Where is Intel in all of this? Despite the US taking a 10% equity stake, Lip-Bu Tan, Intel's current CEO, was not even at that roundtable dinner. That absence raises another question. Why is the government taking 10% in Intel and not in other AI leaders like Meta, OpenAI, and especially Nvidia? Nvidia is the clear frontrunner in AI GPUs and often the most valuable company in the world, and it is also American. So what makes Intel so special? Or is something else going on? As it turns out, this 10% investment is not quite what it looks like.
The key to this story goes back to August 2022 and the CHIPS and Science Act passed under the Biden administration. This law set aside billions of dollars to support semiconductor research and manufacturing, including $52 billion specifically for foundries. Foundries are huge factories that produce chips. This is where the US had fallen behind. Even though America has big tech names like Nvidia, AMD, Apple, OpenAI, Meta, and many other firms that design or depend on chips, it was losing badly on the manufacturing side. And this brings us back to Intel. Intel designs its own chips, but it also manufactures them. For a long time, Intel was the leader in this field. It was a giant of the Silicon Valley era and created key technologies such as the x86 architecture. This is why there is no 10% stake in Meta, OpenAI, or even the biggest name in AI chips, Nvidia. Nvidia designs chips, but it does not run its own foundries. For US chip production, the best hope was Intel. Intel matched the government's plan to rebuild US foundries. But there is another important detail. When US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked if the government would invest in Nvidia, he answered, "I don't think Nvidia needs financial support." Intel, on the other hand, needed help. Intel had fallen behind, and the world's leading chip manufacturer was now TSMC, based in Taiwan.
In 2021, TSMC held more than 50% of the global foundry market. Many major clients, including Nvidia and Apple, relied almost entirely on them. Intel decided it wanted to change this. It aimed to return to the top. That same year, Intel launched its IDM 2.0 strategy, a plan to invest $100 billion into foundries. The key change was simple. Instead of only making its own chips, Intel would also manufacture chips for other companies, just like TSMC. That was the plan. In reality, even with support from the CHIPS Act, it did not work. After tens of billions of dollars spent on foundries, Intel was still losing large amounts of money, possibly the most it had ever lost. Meanwhile, TSMC's position became even stronger. Its market share rose to over 70%. By 2025, its market value passed $1 trillion. The numbers tell the story. To be clear, TSMC is not the villain. Its manufacturing is more advanced, more reliable, and has fewer faults. Its customer service is also stronger. On almost every front, it was outperforming Intel. For the US, TSMC is a strategic concern because it is based in Taiwan. But the bigger problem is China. China has been building huge state-backed funds for semiconductors. One of these funds has registered capital of 344 billion yuan, or about $47.5 billion. This shows how serious President Xi Jinping is about making China self-sufficient in chip production. China has been pouring tens of billions into its own chip makers, and there is a key difference in how it does it. These are not just subsidies, they are direct state investments. YMTC, a Chinese chip manufacturer, received a 12.9 billion yuan investment from state-owned sources in 2023. The National Silicon Industry Group, another Chinese semiconductor company, is listed on the stock market, but 20.64% of it is owned by the China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. The US is not winning the race in semiconductor manufacturing. This leads to a difficult question. If China can use the state to support its national champions, why should America hold back? Intel, as the biggest US foundry company, was the obvious candidate for support, and it badly needed help. That brings us back to the 10% stake. But it was not a simple investment. After Intel appointed Lip-Bu Tan as CEO, Trump called for his resignation, saying Tan had links to China and was highly conflicted. Tan had previously led Cadence Design Systems, a company that had been charged with violating US export controls to China and had sold tech to a military school in China. Tan then went to Washington to meet Trump and discuss ways the government and Intel could work together towards achieving the administration's goals. On 22nd August, Intel announced that the US government would make an $8.9 billion investment in Intel common stock. Washington would gain a 9.9% stake in Intel, or more accurately, inherit one. The government was said to be buying Intel shares at a $4 discount to the closing share price of $24.80. But the deal was unusual. Technically, no money actually changed hands. At least there was no normal share purchase on the open market. The reason goes back to the CHIPS Act. When you look further into Intel's announcement, you see what was really happening.
The president is correct in the sense that there is no new money going into this deal. This is previously committed CHIPS Act money and previously committed funds from a program called Secure Enclave, which was a Biden-Harris administration.
The government's equity stake will be funded by the remaining $5.7 billion in grants previously awarded but not yet paid to Intel under the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, and $3.2 billion awarded to the company as part of the Secure Enclave program. In simple terms, Intel was already meant to receive this money as a lump sum grant. Instead, the U.S. government chose to turn that grant into shares.
This has left investors confused and worried. Intel did not have a spare 10% stake lying around, and the government did not buy existing stock on the open market. The only way to make room was to issue new shares. That diluted current shareholders, cutting their voting power and reducing their share of the company. Unsurprisingly, many were unhappy. Investor James McRitchie put it bluntly. It sets a bad precedent if the president can just take 10% of a company by threatening the CEO. There is another risk, too. With Washington now a major shareholder, Intel's image abroad changes. Around 76% of Intel's revenue comes from outside the US, and 29% comes from China alone. Foreign customers and regulators may now see Intel as an arm of the US state and think twice about backing it. That, in turn, can help Trump's broader goals. On top of that, the deal exposes Intel to extra scrutiny under anti-subsidy rules. Many countries have laws that target firms backed by foreign governments. Intel was honest about these risks in its own filings, but that did not calm investors. There is another twist. Intel is in bad shape, but it was not desperate for this specific money. Tan himself admitted as much. Just days before the US stake was announced, SoftBank had invested $2 billion into Intel. So why accept the government deal? Some people believe Tan did it to keep his job and reduce pressure from Trump. If that is true, it may have made Intel's situation even harder. The Wall Street Journal's Greg Ip summed up the logic from the Washington side. Sometimes a company or industry risks failing without public support, and that failure would hurt the whole country, not just its shareholders and employees. Intel meets both conditions. It isn't failing, but it is losing money, its core business is in decline, and it lacks the capital and customers needed to make the most advanced semiconductors. It's in the US's best interest if their biggest foundry owner or chip producer stays afloat. For Intel, there is at least one clear benefit. Under the original CHIPS Act grants, Intel had to meet strict milestones, build foundries on time, hit manufacturing targets, and accept clawback rules that allowed the government to reclaim some of the money or even profits if targets were missed. Intel also had to share a slice of its cash flow with the US Commerce Department. By turning the grant into equity, much of that burden disappears.
That is now off the table. Intel no longer has to hit specific milestones to receive this money. From Washington's side, the approach still has a logic. Even when people like Tim Cook or Sundar Pichai promise hundreds of billions in future US investment, it is hard to know how much will really happen. There is a clear example of this. In 2017, Foxconn, one of Apple's main manufacturers, promised a $10 billion LCD factory in Wisconsin and 13,000 jobs. Over time, that plan shrank to about $672 million and roughly 1,400 jobs. The original headline numbers never came close to reality. Words are cheap, so it is understandable that the US government would rather hold something concrete it can control instead of trusting big promises from tech CEOs. With China pouring huge sums into semiconductors and TSMC dominating from Taiwan, Trump is under pressure to respond. A 10% stake in Intel looks odd at first glance, but it is not as unusual as it sounds. Around the world, governments have treated key industries, especially chips, as strategic assets. The German state of Lower Saxony owns 20% of Volkswagen. The Taiwanese government holds 6.4% of TSMC. In South Korea, 8.6% of Samsung is owned by the National Pension Service, even though Samsung is not directly state-owned. The French and German governments each own around 10% of Airbus, and the Spanish government owns about 4%. All of these are market economies. This pattern has existed for years. The only real change is the target sector. Instead of cars, banks, farming, or oil, the world has decided that the most important industry to control is semiconductors. But one big question remains. How did Intel end up in such a bad position in the first place? This was the godfather of chips. It ran the largest US foundry business, benefited from the CHIPS Act, and made billions putting its processors into almost every Windows machine. Yet today, it is about $10 billion in the red. What went wrong? And why is Intel now suing its former CEO? To find out, watch the next video in this series.